Excellent. Great. Um, Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are, when you're listening to this, etc. My name is Machiko Walcott. I am the principal consultant at AMAA Analytics. I work with different organizations of various types and sizes around the world on data and analytics, but on things outside of technical aspects of data and analytics. So things like strategy, management, org structure, processes, capabilities, soft skills, and even culture related to data and analytics. So pretty much everything except actually doing analytics. I do have a technical background, just to make that clear. As I mentioned the last time, I am doing a series of 30-minute, relatively informal Q&A sessions on various non-technical topics about data and analytics, since we're all kind of stuck inside with the COVID-19 crisis. So a little bit of housekeeping. Again, the session will be 30 minutes. Please keep video off. It just kind of makes it easier for everybody. You are all muted and won't be able to unmute yourself. This is not because I'm a control freak, but it's really just to make it easier for me to run a one-person show. If you have any questions you would like to see addressed about the topic for the day, please enter them in the chat box and I'll see them and I'll try to address them as much as I can. They will come directly to me. Because of the short time we have, I will only address questions that are directly related to the topic at hand, and we'll look to revisit the remaining questions later in other sessions. This session is being recorded, so people who registered will get a link to the recording. Now, today's session is the second of the series, and we continue with a topic from the last session, enterprise processes to generate value from analytics and innovation. So this is the part 2. It is intended for technical leaders of analytics, statistics, data science, be it current or future leaders. If you missed the last session, the recording is available at the Insight Analytics YouTube channel. And now this is an introductory overview, so we won't get into specifics, in part because we don't have time, and in part because after a certain level of specifics, the specifics will vary for each situation after a certain level. But my hope is that this might help you reframe the problem towards more lofty goals like analytical culture and effective cross-functional collaborations and things like that. Now, you might be asking things like, well, is this more for developed markets? Is it for less developed markets? Does it apply to my market? I can say, though, from my experience across many countries, that these problems are pretty universal. They know no geopolitical boundaries. So at the fundamental level, we're pretty much all the same, and I see it in every market I've been and I've worked in. I do think that we have a tendency to kind of want to think something like, well, we're different from them. But at the end of the day, we are all humans, and humans have human problems. So while the sessions are kind of directed at a US-based audience, really only from a language perspective, nothing I address today is specific to any one market or sector. Before we get too far, I do use the term analytics, statistics, data science pretty much interchangeably in the session. And in fact, I do use analytics, the word analytics, most of the time just to simplify things. But please do know that it is all applicable, regardless of which one you consider yourself to be, whether you consider yourself to be data scientist, statistician, or analytics professional. This is all pretty much the same. So, all right. I started the last session by explaining the idea of the value of analytics and how critical that is today, especially in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. So I mentioned a recent webinar saying that we'll need to show our business value or we'll get cut just like anybody else with a crisis going on. And that common metric of 60 to 70% of analytics efforts do not meet expectations or business expectations. So even without the crisis, we have a value problem as a profession. Now, we can keep on saying that analytics is important, it's critical, but then we become a pure expense if we can't show value. And expenses get cut in tough times. And so we really need to zero in on the value to the business or to the client if we want to survive. Now, that value could be monetary, financial, something tangible, or otherwise, but still we need to focus on the value that we're producing. Then we talked about enterprise processes designed to produce that value. So we saw what the framework looked like, and we will continue to see that today. Now, we are not talking about applying analytics to analyze processes, but rather about creating an enterprise process to facilitate and promote what we do as analytics professionals so that we can produce that value. Now, we see that it is not a linear process, that the four functions, the analytics function, the data function, business, technology, participate throughout this process, that this needs to be deliberately defined, documented, communicated, agreed to, and rolled out, just like any other repeatable enterprise processes, so that we can set expectations on how we want to collaborate with the other functions. And more importantly, the value from the analytics has a chance to be generated only when we go around the wheel completely and on to the next cycle. So if we get stuck somewhere in between the pies, we're not going to be able to generate that value that business is looking for. So this is very important. Now, this is all part of the organizational system, as Deming would call it, the organizational infrastructure, if you would. We don't want to over-engineer this, though, or it becomes a bureaucracy very, very quickly. It doesn't need to strike a balance and not prescribe 100% of the activities. So I often get accused for abusing the 80-20 Pareto rule, but for something like this, a good practical process should be applicable about 80% of the time, with the rest needing some exceptions. So 80-20 is a good rule of thumb, and just so that it's not 20-80 or unfortunately too often, 0-100. We talked about the scope of this process. As the word enterprise might suggest, the scope is at least over the entire organization. And the scope is beyond the entire organization in some cases. For example, if you're an analytics consulting firm, so I might use the word environment as a placeholder for the concept in these cases, but it is far-reaching and it's a lot wider than we might expect or we might think. So then we also saw that there are some common disconnects in the context of this process framework. Now, whether you come from the business perspective or from the analytics professional perspective, we tend to equate analytics as just the develop part. So this part, the third portion, where it says develop, we tend to equate analytics as just that part, or at best, just the design, develop, and deploy, so from 2 to 4, which then creates barriers to going the whole way around the wheel. And recall that the value is created when you go all the way from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and back to 1. So that said, let's put our age-old complaint in this context. Our clients don't involve us early enough. How many times have we heard this? How many times have we said this? Now, we've all experienced challenges with clients coming to us saying, well, I just need the p-value, or I just need a model, I just need an analytic, I just need this to be available in production. Well, This happens because a client equates the whole of analytics with the analytical mechanics, that is, just a set of procedures, methods, techniques, and pure logic, or let's essentially just the developed slice of the pie rather than the entire wheel. And unfortunately, we don't often help our own cause as analytics professionals, even if we're well-meaning. We even make things worse, actually, by doing or saying things that take the business straight out of the process, even if we mean well. And so we're not doing much of anything really effective to help our clients rethink the notion of analytics, and we're actually making it worse more often than you think. So what do we do then when our clients don't involve us early enough? I want to reposition this a little bit. Clients come to us proactively and early only when they are analytically more mature. Now, I mean that not in the sense of the academic or scientific knowledge or understanding about statistics or analytics or data science, but in the sense of having experienced and appreciated the value that comes from the entire process. Now, remember that the analytical mechanics is just one slice of this pie. The reality is that the vast majority of the clients are not analytically mature in this sense. Now, I have made, I've made an entire business on organizational analytical maturity and culture, and I won't get into details here other than to say that it is so often misunderstood. What do we mean by analytical maturity? And we tend to think a lot more of the kind of the academic knowledge side of things, but that's really not where the disconnect or the gap is. But anyways, while it doesn't mean that, it does mean that our expectations that we place as analytical professionals on our clients are misaligned. So we are essentially expecting something that just isn't going to happen. Then we complain about it when it rightly doesn't happen. So we're really not fixing anything. So the clients, expecting that the clients are going to come to us and early enough and so forth, in a large majority of cases, is just really not realistic. So this deal with analytical maturity is not trivial. So let's try to visualize this a little bit with this process wheel. So you have the 4 functions as participants, and the steps move because somebody's either pushing forward from one step to the next, or somebody is standing in the next step, pulling into it what's behind. In a mature environment, or with a mature client base, or with a mature organization, business, the impetus works so that the business pushes, or business or client pushes forward in early steps, that is discover and design, towards develop. And the business is also standing in an inform and act, pulling from develop or deploy, develop and deploy. The key really idea is that the impetus in these cases, in the mature environment, comes from the business. So you've got a pulling, or you got a pushing going on from 1 to 2 to 3, and then things are being pulled into inform and act, etc. But when the environment is not mature, we, the analytics professionals, have to do the pulling, especially in the early stages towards the from discover design into design and develop. But that's not enough. Our head really has to be going even further back. So instead of starting to pull from discover, design into develop, we actually have to start our pulling here in inform and act and go all the way around like that, so that we can help them connect the inform and act to discover. This is one of the bigger disconnects. So the funny thing is that even though we say all the time that we want them to involve us, we want them, meaning business, to involve us earlier, This is a problem because we're still, waiting for the business to push towards us what we need to be pulling. And not only that, by thinking that our involvement starts in the discover step, we are actually not thinking early enough. This is a challenge. So you have different combinations of, pulling and pushing and so forth between these steps. And the analytical maturity or the readiness or even the culture of an environment, so that includes all the participants, the different functions and businesses and clients and so forth, the maturity or readiness or culture of that environment has a lot to do with who is doing the pushing and pulling at which step. Where is the impetus? Who is creating that impetus? Now, that said, I put analytics and innovation under the same topic because first, it turns out that analytics and innovation have a lot of organizational aspects in common. And that includes processes, roles and responsibilities, cultures, etc. Second, the processes for getting analytics the processes for getting the business value from innovation are essentially the same as the processes for getting the business value from analytics. So there's a lot in common between innovation and analytics from a kind of enterprise perspective. And third, the organizations with quote unquote analytical cultures, whatever that means, also tends to have innovative cultures. And this is actually backed up by any number of research studies. So there's something going on where analytics and innovation are quite related to each other at the organizational or at the enterprise environment level. Now, there was a question that was submitted. Is there a specific type of business unit where you see more business value being driven from analytics than others? The industries and business areas where analytics is mandated and regulated are generally much farther along than others. And this makes sense because there are obvious regulatory consequences if you don't. But remember that this is an enterprise deal. It's not really a business unit or business area deal or business problem deal. So what happens is that there's often a dichotomy within organizations that supposedly have more mature analytical practices. So you get something like some parts of the organization are highly advanced while other parts aren't. And so the enterprise as a whole isn't really all that analytically mature. You see this pretty commonly in industry sectors that are highly regulated, like financial services and healthcare and so forth. But it's anybody, really any industry that has one part of the business highly advanced in analytics and others not so much, this happens a good bit. And another related question that was submitted to this is, well, how do I apply this in public organizations, public sector organizations? This is a really good question for a number of reasons. Now, the short answer is that, yes, the same process framework still applies in public sectors as well as in private sectors, pretty much any sector you can think of. Now, the differences are really more around the considerations for implementing the process. So for one thing, the idea of monetary value is a little bit different, going to be a little bit different for public sectors, and it's going to be less direct, especially when it comes to things like revenue side of things. Now, the cost side of things, obviously, is still applicable. But in the public sector, the basis for defining values often more along the lines of effectiveness. How well you do what you do, how much impact you make in the lives of people, et cetera, et cetera. So you want a good understanding of how you define that value and in order to generate that value. Now, another layer of consideration is the scope of the enterprise. So you may go across agencies, you might have different layers of government from federal to state to local, there may be public-private partnerships, then where do the individual citizens fall into this framework and so on. So the nature of the stakeholders is different. And a lot of times you don't have a whole lot of control over the organizations in terms of things like reporting structures and certain types of accountability. Now, that said, in general, this has less to do with formal organizational structures and much more to do with roles and responsibilities and how to influence them effectively to be involved and engaged. And so we'll get into more specifics on the roles and responsibilities in some of the future sessions. Now, after all this, I haven't really addressed any of that. Well, how am I going to do this? We'll eventually slowly get to that. And a lot of this is going to be in future sessions. And the reason is that this is not really a tactical problem. It's easy to treat the symptom, but that doesn't really cure the disease, so to speak. So it's important to understand where the whole problem is coming from and what the root cause of all this is before we get into, well, let's try to solution this doing these kind of tactics. So one of the things that I think is going to come up, though, is that, well, whose responsibility is this? Right? Also, you've kind of talked about the whole enterprise processes, some of the functions that kind of participate in it and so forth. Well, analytics is only a part of this entire, the whole process, or one of the participants. What we do, where we're really, really good at, which is the third slice of the pie, the develop, is really just one part of the whole process. So then whose responsibility is this? Right? It's challenging, and it's a very good question. Now, if you're familiar with some of the lean process improvement concepts, there are a couple of key points that we absolutely need to keep in mind. And even if you're not familiar with it, these are good points to keep in mind. The value of a product, and I want to position analytics as a product. I want to emphasize this point. The value of a product is determined by the person at the end, the end consumer, if you will. So we're going to have people who produce the product analytic, and there's a person or somebody at the end who's consuming that. So the value of the analytics is determined by the consumer, in this case, business, client, etc. What do consumers want? What do we as consumers want, just in general, right? If I want something, I want my problem solved completely. So then if we are analytics leaders and professionals, it becomes our responsibility to solve the client's problem completely with respect to analytics. Now, to be very clear, for most analytics professionals, things like business process engineering and organizational design are not within the scope of their capabilities. And so it's not necessarily your responsibility to do this or to build this. It's important not to confuse execution with ownership. But it is the responsibility of the analytics leaders to recognize and lead this. And by knowing that it needs to be done, and by involving and collaborating with those who do have the capability to do these things, and getting all the stakeholders on board, meaning it is your responsibility to own and orchestrate the total solution so that you and your organization can solve the client problem completely with respect to analytics. Now, you might say, I just want to do analytics. Why is it our responsibility to do this? Well, if we don't start it, then no one will. It's that simple. Now, keep in mind that we still have this need to show business value so we can survive, especially in a crisis situation. Now, Deming did say survival is optional. Now, what this means that if you don't care about survival, then maybe you don't need to care about this. But you choose to be in this profession and you have to care, or you will eventually be replaced by, let's say, AI. Oh, the irony, right? So with AI moving towards cognitive tasks and not just physical or logical tasks, we need to be asking ourselves what our differentiators are. What will you bring to the table that AI is not or will not be able to bring to the table? And for those who say, well, I am not high up enough in management to be able to command this. Well, anyone at any level can be an influencer. You are much more effective being an influencer than a pure top-down manager anyway. Command by authority is basically dead in today's world. And that's, well, entirely another topic for another day. So, don't see a whole lot of questions. So we'll stop this for right now because we are indeed coming up close on the 30-minute mark. And please do send me follow-up questions. Please also send your thoughts regarding any non-technical topics you'd like to see covered that I might be able to address. Please give me a follow on LinkedIn, Twitter, my website, the YouTube channel, and as well as please share the material with anybody you might think might be could benefit from this. The next session will be in a week, same time, same place, on a topic to be determined. I'll send that out tomorrow morning, blast out by tomorrow morning. That will be LinkedIn, Twitter, my website, a few email lists, and so forth. And if you registered, you'll receive an email from me with a recording. And thank you for your time. Have a great rest of the day and hope to see you back again next week.